Um, Welcome. I'll first start sharing my screen, and a very warm welcome to all the delegates for this instruction course. And this instruction, one moment please. Yeah. So you're able to hear me and you are able to see my screen. So yeah, so the instruction course is on common mistakes in glaucoma diagnosis and treatment, and I thank Dr. Ragini and team MOS for accepting my IC. And the thing is, we learn more from mistakes than we learn from our successes. And it is always better to learn from others' mistakes, because then it saves us the heartburn of facing the consequences of our own mistakes. So today we are going to learn from very experienced glaucoma specialists of Maharashtra, and this is the instruction course about that common mistakes in glaucoma diagnosis and treatment. And we have, the first will be Dr. Pooja Bhomaj, who is a glaucoma specialist from Meerut. She is going to talk to us about her mistakes she is probably made in disc and gonioscopy. Dr. Rita Dhamankar, a very senior glaucoma specialist from Panvel and Mumbai, and she is going to talk about mistakes in perimetry. Dr. Sachin Dharwadkar, a glaucoma specialist from Mumbai, he is going to talk to us about his mistakes in OCT interpretation. And Dr. Rupali Neldikar, a glaucoma specialist from Pune, she is going to be talking about where she could have handled medical management better. And I am going to talk, I am Dr. Preeti Kandar, I am a glaucoma specialist from Mumbai, and I am going to talk to you about the mistakes I have made in trabeculectomy and how to correct them. And the special part about this IC is there is a lot of time given for discussion, because discussion is the way we actually learn. And hence I will stop my screen sharing, and I invite Dr. Pooja Bhomaj to start her screen sharing and start with her talk about her mistakes in disc and gonioscopy. Pooja, can you please start your screen?
Yeah, I'll share.
Yes, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Almost afternoon, I think. Yeah, my topic on my mistakes in disc evaluation and gonioscopy. First case I'm going to discuss is about a 62-year-old male patient who has systemic problems, comes to our OPD with sudden diminution of vision. Visual acuity in right eye is 6/6 and left eye is 6/60. Anterior segment appears relatively normal on Van Eyck's. The EC appears to be deep enough, and IOP is on screen examination. IOP is normal. Since the patient has sudden diminution of vision, dilated examination is directly done without doing a gonioscopy. And on disc examination, this is the finding. So the patient has left eye CRVO and right eye on just preliminary examination, it doesn't appear very bad. But when we look very carefully, there is a nerve fiber layer defect. But this we noted on the second follow-up. So when we had a better look at the patient. So the patient came on second or third follow-up. We had already missed gonioscopy. Gonioscopy was not done because the patient had come with sudden diminution of vision and just basic anterior segment examination. So next follow-up, the patient's pressures were higher, and this time we did a detailed glaucoma evaluation, and this follow-up we came to know that the angles were not open, they were narrow angles. It was an angle closure glaucoma case which has presented with central retinal vein occlusion in the left eye, and right eye has nerve fiber layer defect at the inferior pole of the disc, and YAC PI was done. So basically, CRVO is very commonly associated with glaucoma. So every case of CRVO should be evaluated thoroughly for angle glaucoma. Basically, glaucoma evaluation has to be done for every vein occlusion cases, not only CRVO, BRVOs, or all the vein occlusions should be evaluated thoroughly. This is a case with recurrent multiple hemorrhages, BRVO and CRVO. He has glaucoma also, uncontrolled glaucoma in both the eyes. So the patient is on management for glaucoma as well as vein occlusions. Vein occlusions very commonly are associated with glaucoma, and the other eye may be totally asymptomatic, because these findings we might see when we look carefully and we start evaluating all our patients of CRVO with care. We tend to find out nerve fiber defects. This is a small disc, so crowded disc with the nerve fiberlets defects, and the other eye is having CRVO. Now we have put a protocol in our retina section that we need to evaluate all the vein occlusions for glaucoma. So the next follow-up, the patient is undergoes a detailed glaucoma evaluation, and we try to identify glaucoma earlier in the other eye. Yeah, that was the message. Then this is another case. It's a 52-year-old male patient. At presentation, the pressures were 25 and 17, and CCT was 550 and 545. Right eye was pseudophakic, left eye was phakic. Gonioscopically, the angles were open. When we just looked at the disc was relatively okay. A small disc, both side, left side, the disc was smaller than the right. There was a vertical cup in the right eye, but we didn't suspect a very bad glaucoma. And patient had not given the history of taking oral acetazolamide the 5 days before coming to our OPD. Patient was trying to judge, I don't know, it was referred for our evaluation, but then patient did not reveal the history of taking tablets. But on follow-up, when the tablets or oral acetazolamide had worn out and he was on topical medications, his pressures were high. And when we went back and saw the disc, we found that there is RNFL slit defect seen, and the OCT shows RNFL defect in the same area. So sometimes it is very easy to miss a disc changes or nerve fiber layer defect changes in a small disc cases, especially if the patient is having high IOP and a small disc. We need to look at them more carefully and evaluate them more thoroughly. The perimetry findings were absolutely normal in this particular case. My third case is a 26-year-old female patient. She's a medical student. I got biased because she is a very young medical student, and the pressure were 16, almost normal. She was on anti-glaucoma medications, but the corneas were thick. So when I saw the disc, I didn't straight away conclude that she has glaucoma. Definitely there is disc changes seen in the left eye, but I carried away by the feeling that she is a very young patient, medical student, and so we probably need to evaluate before just jumping and saying that she definitely has glaucoma. We did do a perimetry also, but the perimetry was absolutely normal. So perimetry normal and thick corneas made me feel maybe she doesn't have glaucoma, and we need to evaluate her better, and then coming to a conclusion that she is a case of juvenile open angle glaucoma. OCT had findings which suggested that there were no fiber layer defect, and ganglionic cell layer thinning was there. In the left eye, we can clearly see that the macular GCL thinning is there. But then after a few follow-ups, one day she came with pressures which were really high. That time we decided and went ahead and did a 10-2 study. And on 10-2, we could clearly see a field defect. Actually, I don't know whether this field defect is visible, but on 10-2, superior arcuate field defect was seen, which was corresponding to the inferior part of the optic nerve head, which is clearly seen on her previous fundus photograph. We can see that the area's pallor is there in the inferior part. So 10-2 evaluation was important in this particular case and diagnosis. My last case is a patient, elderly patient, who was on Lumigan and multiple anti-glaucoma medications. Basically, she was on maximal anti-glaucoma medications. So obviously her eye looked very red or congested, and corneas were relatively normal. So for our population, 510 and 520, and uncontrolled glaucoma. Discs were looking not very good. So since it was an uncontrolled medically managed glaucoma, we planned to go ahead with left eye trabeculectomy, but this is what happened. So trab, we ended with the choroidals, which was not resolving by routine management, had needed surgical intervention to treat the choroidals. What we had missed was gonio finding. When we went back and saw the other eye of the patient had blood in the Schlemm's canal, and the eye definitely had episcleral veins, dilated and tortuous episcleral veins. we had missed this in the first finding. She was a case of uncontrolled glaucoma on maximal medications because of raised episcleral venous pressure. There was no other systemic specific cause leading to raised episcleral venous pressure, but maybe it was an idiopathic cause. But this is one thing that we might miss once in a while. For an uncontrolled glaucoma, we should be looking at the gonio finding and see whether there is blood in the Schlemm's canal, and also whether there are tortuous episcleral veins, which could suggest that the patient might be having raised episcleral venous pressure. So be careful while operating such patients. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Pooja, those were those were wonderful cases, and there is a take-home message for each case, and we will discuss all that when we come to the end of the session.
Yeah.
Now we have our second talk is by Dr. Rita Dhamankar, and she will be talking to us on her mistakes on perimetry, now on retrospective thinking and what she could have done to avoid those mistakes. Dr. Rita, please, if you could start your screen sharing.
Hello everybody, good afternoon. We've had a wonderful session start by Pooja. She's really given us a lot of information on how to look at discs, and I think it was an excellent presentation. My presentation is not going to be half as good because I had a disc crash yesterday and I had to redo the whole presentation today morning. So let's see what we can do. So my mistakes in interpreting perimetry. Thank you, MOS, for letting us do this presentation. So why is perimetry done? It's done to look for defects in the visual fields, to identify whether they are typical of pathology, what is the severity of the disease, if the disease is steady over a period of time, and if not, does it increase in size, depth, or is there a new defect? If there is a progression, what is the rate of progression? My interpretation should actually be able to look at all these parameters for it to be useful in clinical practice. And mistakes do happen, just like it happened in this slide. So the first thing that all of us actually need to do now, I'm going to talk from a retrospective point of view.
Rita, can you go into full screen?
I'm sorry, I'm not on full screen. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So we have to look at the printout basically. Now, if you see, do you see the data? There are so many data points. And do you really need to see every point in detail every time? Is it really possible? No. So whenever you see a change, you must see every detail. And that's where mistakes can actually happen. Let's start with where I could go wrong. When you see the printout, it is very important for us to look at some details like the name.
Madam, slideshow is not active.
Yeah, slideshow. Go into slideshow.
Slideshow, just press that button. You're on the icon.
At the bottom.
You pressed it.
I have, okay, just a second.
No.
Yes, slide.
Here at the bottom.
That one, correct.
At the bottom,
correct,
yes.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Now can you see it?
No,
it's
still it is
no.
not getting activated.
No.
अरे क्या हो गया मेरा प्रॉब्लम हो गया है
No problem.
Okay, continue.
Continue. We can see. No problems. Continue, please.
I'm sorry. So grayscales we know do show a pattern. And can you spot a pattern in this one? Yes. If you look carefully, it's only then that you will see this clover leaf pattern, and which means that this patient has been not attentive, and he's been just attentive in the beginning of the test, and later on he's gone to sleep or whatever. And here you can see, if you look at the grayscale, when we say don't look at the grayscale, just eyeball it, you can see these big white spots here. And you know that paracentrally, the threshold is 36 and 38, and superonasally, the threshold has gone up to 41 and 43. So you know that definitely this patient is a superman. All tests are compared to age-related normal. So age is compared in 10-year intervals. That is 41 to 50, 51 to 60. So if you have tested a patient at the age of 59, he falls in the decade of 51 to 60. But when he's tested at 61, he gets into another group. So the database completely changes. So you have to keep that in mind. Now the date of birth is important. If you look at these two fields, this patient it is the same patient who has been done. He has been done twice, simply because the first time we saw there was a big mean defect. Here it is showing minus 6.17. And then when I checked the age that he was corrected was 20 years lesser than his normal age. So when we really corrected the age, we found that there was absolutely no progression. And then we all know that there is a learning curve. So I've had patients who had learning curves. They do 4 fields, 5 fields, 10 fields. Sometimes they don't even get to normal. So it is very important that you keep repeating the test, or if you find that at the end of the learning curve, they are just not learning, then it is better to leave perimetry out of your ideas of doing the perimetry. Now, for instance, if you look at this patient, this was a patient who's a 70-year-old patient on a follow-up for PACG, but this is maybe the nth test that he's doing. But if you look at the fixation losses, he's got like 4 out of 15 fixation losses. And in this field, I'm sorry, I could not change it. He's got 6 out of 17 fixation losses. Now look at this patient. Do you see something unusual? Look at the probability map of the total deviation. Now, if you look at the probability map, it is absolutely normal. And if you look at this pattern standard deviation, you see that there are a lot of faults. Now, if there are no defects in the total deviation.
Madam, again, the slide is not seen which you are discussing. I can only see, if I don't know what Dr. Preeti is saying, but I can only see the grayscale show a pattern. That's all. That screen is frozen there. We can't see ahead of that.
Oh my God.
You're
Dr.
on
Preeti, can you
slide
see?
number 6. You're on slide number 6. Which slide are you on? We can see slide number 6.
1 second. I'll just escape, go back to my, okay. You were on slide number 6.
We are on, yes, we could see slide number 6. Which one were you
Now
seeing?
it is scrolling. Now
Now it's scrolling. Yes.
So how about if I don't, I don't know.
No, go back to whichever slide you were you were talking about, and then we'll see, it will scroll probably.
Okay.
Yes,
Now, can you see?
yes, we can, yes.
I
yes.
just go on to screen share and tell me whether you can see this. Can you see the artifacts?
See,
wala
we
slide?
are able to see. We are able to see.
but not in slideshow. We are able to see the slide sorter. But that's fine. You can go ahead.
But that's all right. We are able to see. So go ahead, please.
So there are a lot of artifacts in perimetry which you have to take care of. Now here is a rim artifact in a patient who's a very high myope. He's a very high hypermetrope. He's using very thick glasses, and you can see that there is a big rim artifact that is seen. So you have to change them and get them to their normal refraction or wear a contact lens. Now here you see that this is a patient who's had a ptosis, and once the lid has been tapped up, then you can see that the field has come absolutely normal. Now this is a patient who was myotic. I mean, his pupils were really thin, small, and when we dilated him, we saw that the field completely changed. But the thing that you must remember is you must always correlate clinically. For instance, if you look at this field, if you look at this disc, this is an optic disc drusen, which is actually leading to these perimetric defects. And if you look at this is an Optos photo, which is showing us these pigments all along the nerve fiber layer.
Madam, we can't see again what you are talking, actually.
It's frozen.
Again, it's frozen.
Again, it's frozen.
No,
So
we are actually not coming with you only, actually.
okay,
Now
I think
it's
we go to
scrolling.
the slideshow. That will be probably best.
But slideshow, is it working? You said it was frozen.
Now,
Go
no,
to
no,
the-
not slideshow. Now can you see?
Yeah, this is the
Yes,
image you are
yes.
talking about. Correct.
Slide
Yeah, now I can
17.
see.
Yes.
This is the slide that I'm talking about, where you can see that you can see these defects very clearly. But if you look at this, you can see there's a lot of pigment distribution all along.
Yes,
So the
yes.
segment epithelium is very thin. So
Correct.
very clear. And that is why you are getting a defect which represents glaucoma. Now, if you look at this, does this defect look glaucomatous? Yes. If you weren't to have a look at the disc clearly, this would look like a glaucomatous defect. But you can see that there is definitely another retinal pathology like a hemorrhage, which is showing out to be a glaucomatous defect. And look at this. Is this defect glaucomatous? Yeah. You would look at this and not look. If you look at this, that defects are all respecting the midline. And if you see, that means that it is an absolutely neurological defect. And the perimetry, if you see, is the only functional test to look for defects in the visual pathway. Now, when you see a total diffuse total deviation defect, we know that the patient could be bored, he could be tired, he has a bad day, he has a Mayo's pupil, or he has a very high refractive index. So it is best.
Rita,
Yep.
just can you summarize in about 30 seconds?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Okay, so you have to know which test to order and why. You have to look at the progression, and there are various tests and progression that you look at. And I would actually tell you the only best thing for you to do is to look at the progression and look at the same test when you're doing the progression, because when you look at an overview or a GPA printout, if you're not comparing the same test, you will get totally different readings. So you need to compare with two reliable baseline fields, and you need to change your baseline after every intervention. And the truth is that we will all make mistakes and learn from them. And thank you very much for your time. And I'm sorry about this technical glitch. I'll have to actually look into my hard disk again.
No, but after having a crashed hard disk, I'm thankful that you came, you took the time and the trouble of making the presentation again. So thank you, Rita, for a wonderful presentation, and all the best with your hard disk.
Yes.
It's a trauma. And next we have Dr. Sachin Dharwadkar, who's a glaucoma specialist from Mumbai. He's going to talk to us about his mistakes in OCT interpretation. Dr. Sachin, please go ahead.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, and we can hear you also.
So this is a typical OCT printout of yesteryears, because this was in the very, very early times in 2006-7. When we used to see these more frequently. But this is a prototype map from 2014. Now this is of a 56-year-old male, and the data is given on the left side. And looking at the OCT report, would we think that the report is normal, abnormal? Would we not like to comment, or would we repeat the test? Now this was my favorite slide to in most of my OCT presentations, and I always got answers. Well, the fact that I got answers on this question is itself indicative that this slide needs to be there for many more presentations, because there should be no answer. Simple reason being, there is no scan that is provided. So where is the scan or the disk picture? So if you cannot have a scan or the T-SNIT curve which is seen, then you cannot definitely comment on what this report shows. So that is the first mistake. We should always avoid even looking at reports that does not contain the scan. That is a cardinal fundamental mistake. Even if you own a OCT, make sure that you have a printout that has a scan image. Otherwise, you will be taken for a ride. If the optometrist has done some shoddy job, then you will be misinterpreting disease and over-treating patients unnecessarily. Now, this is the second OCT. Looking at the scan, everything looks pretty okay. On cursory examination, everything is green and you are happy and the patient is happy. But if you look closely at the T-SNIT curve, here you see a small notch. Now, why was the scan done in the first place? Because you suspected something clinically, not because you wanted to see red or green. So the mistake here is that if you do not actually look at the area of concern and you go for these maps directly and see that all is green, you will never pick up the small defect that is actually staring at you, because this is a average of the sector and not a specific area. Now, if you see on the SLO image also, you can see a slit RNFL defect here. So the important point is, whenever you suspect something clinically, note in which part of the OCT you are actually going to get the defect and look for it. You can see here that the comparable disc photo is giving you a RNFL defect in the inferior temporal quadrant. So it is important to look at the quadrant that is clinically suspect and correlate to disc, rather than looking at the interpretation of the report. You do not pay for the opinion of the machine. You pay for the acquisition of the machine. We have to just remember this very clearly. So this is exactly the location of the slit defect, and it is perfectly correlating clinically into a glaucomatous defect. Now look at this case. It's a bilateral angle closure glaucoma. The patient had one episode of angle closure, and these are the reports after the acute episode has subsided. Everything is fine. PI has been done, and this is the OCT. Now, if we have a look at the OCT, the disc and the fields, everything looks beautiful and nice. You will be happy. You will counsel the patient that everything is fine and we don't expect a problem, and we'll just monitor you. But actually, as I always say, always look at the complete neuron and not only a few parts and patches. So even if you see here, again, everything is in the green. But if you look little bit more closely, there is an inter-eye asymmetry and an inter-hemisphere asymmetry. Now, when this kind of picture is there, then you have to be slightly more careful and vigilant. And if you see the macular ganglion cell map or the macular thickness map, this is not a ganglion cell macular thickness map, you see that there is a thinning at the superior pole, which is corresponding to the thinning on the Tisnet map of the average thickness map, which is shown here. So when such things are there, it means that the disease or the apoptosis of the ganglion cell has already set in, and you should expect some field effects to crop up in the corresponding region in some time. So this should not give us a false sense of security. All green maps, you have to be very, very careful, especially in angle closure disease, because they do not follow the classical rule of open angle. And the defects will be predominant more on the ganglion cell bodies rather than on the RNFL or the disc, which will follow the initial ganglion cell loss. So another example to highlight the point, if you can look here, this is again an angle closure case. If you look at the disc picture, everything looks hunky-dory and nice. And especially the left eye disc appears completely okay to you. But when you see a well segmented and a well done OCT, here you have a RNFL loss in the right side. The left side appears relatively better, but when you look at the ganglion cell, there is a lot of apoptosis that has already taken place. So especially in angle closures, it is important for us to see the entire picture. Do not mistake by not taking the printout of the ganglion cell map. So for each OCT that you do, very, very important for us to get a RNFL and disc map as well as a ganglion cell map and see both these together. Studies say NFL is better than macula, macula better than NFL. You cannot compare parts of the same body. So this macular map is the ganglion cell body, and these are the axons. So it is only one neuron, so you cannot just see half of the body and start commenting on the diagnosis. So very important for you to use both the maps for interpretation so that the picture will be very clear. Okay, so we have to be very careful. Even if this map looks normal, remember that the ganglion cell and the IPL GC IPL map can be adversely affected. Now see, this is another case. The discs look completely okay, but the RNFL map is consistently abnormal. Now looking at this, we would feel biarcuate scotoma will be there, and this appears to be stable over time. You can see this OCT here, and the patient did have a ocular hypertension. When he came to us, he was stable for 3 years on treatment, and there was no problem. Now, if you see, the fields were also quite stable over a period of time. But what we did not see again here for the initial period, this was in a few years ago, I think in 2015-16, when the macular ganglion cell OCT was not that commonly used, and this was the picture. So this is a vertical hemisplit of the macula. Now this is very, very classical neurological picture. This doesn't belong to any glaucomatous pathology. Although the patient had coexisting ocular hypertension, he had something else which you would have missed in case we would have not seen this particular ganglion cell map, and he had something called as a DVX disease. So if you see, one side of the optic tract is atrophic, and because of which he has got a homonymous loss of ganglion cells at the macula. So this is a neurological condition sitting on top of ocular hypertension, which would have easily been mistaken had we not seen the complete picture on the optical coherence tomography. Now, another picture like this, if you can see here, clinically, this appears to be quite okay. The left-sided image, the disc appears to be slightly thin, but what is more suspicious is that the thinning is more in the macular region. So if you see there is advanced field loss, definitely it is not commensurate with the kind of OCT picture that you see. So important for you to correlate the OCT finding with the clinical finding and the visual field. And what it turned out to be was a tumor sitting on the optic chiasm. So this is very, very important for us to know. Very bizarre patterns can be there in neurological defects. So if clinically the OCT does not correlate with the field, then remember something might be amiss and investigate further. Now, leaving you with this one last case, knowing many good machines, superb technologies and everything, some things are still beyond our control, like this particular case. You can see here, This is a patient scan done in 2011 and 2017, and you suddenly notice a shift in the RNFL. Now, it's not that it is thinning or thickening, but it is thinning on one side and thickening from the other side. Even if you go to go and closely see the segmented image, even on the big screen, you wouldn't make out what is happening. So there are certain things that can, even if you have the best technology, that can happen. But the only thing that which was a solace was that average RNFL was the same. So we speculate that some segmentation problem would have occurred here, or maybe there would have been some kind of a PVD which would have changed the profile of the retinal nerve fiber layer without altering the total thickness of the RNFL. So such kind of things do happen, and we should not start panicking, because if we see red and green color, put it into clinical perspective, correlate clinically, and take a decision. So machine is there to help you and not to make the decision for you. Thank you so much for your patient here.
Yeah, thank you, Sachin. That was a wonderful talk. And next we have Dr. Rupali Nerlikar. She's a glaucoma specialist from Pune, and she's going to talk about the mistakes she's made in medical management. Rupali, can you please start your screen sharing? You're muted. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now yes.
I'm going to talk to you about my mistakes in medical management. Let's go on straight to the next case. Let me skip over this. So, in the first case, this patient was a known diabetic, and he had been referred for an opinion about his glaucoma. He did give a history of some infection in the eye, which had resolved on treatment. He was at that point on 3 drugs, all of them inflow drugs for intraocular pressure control, and has had lots of medications being tried in combinations before, with not adequate success in getting the IOP to the desired level. That's what his data is. And you can see in the right eye that he has a corneal scar, no vascularization, and normal depth chambers. The intraocular pressures were as mentioned, and the Myers was slightly distorted because of the scar in the right eye, and the angles were open. So we decided that, okay, PG analog has not been tried. Let's start with that. And we started with the PG analog and continued the other medications, deciding that once the pressure settles, we will wean them off. After 5 days, the patient called saying that there was redness and discomfort. And because we started on prostaglandin, I reassured him saying that, yes, it's a known side effect to have some redness, and we will see him back as scheduled. On the 9th day, the patient said that it was becoming very sore, and he felt that there was more blurriness, and his vision had dropped. He had developed some amount of corneal edema, though there was no active keratitis. There were fresh KPs and an anterior chamber reaction, and his pressure had shot up. The first thing, we omitted the travoprost, which was the only change we had made in the intervening time, and started him on oral acetazolamide. And then, remembering that he had a history of some eye infection, went back to the note, looked at some vague mention somewhere of it being a herpetic disease. So that was when the ball dropped, and I realized it was a herpetic keratouveitis that had been activated by the prostaglandin. And so we put him back on frequent topical steroids, homatropin, and on the advice of the cornea person, covered it also with oral acyclovir. And after 5 days, the patient had become comfortable. The congestion had gone away. His vision had started to improve, and he was on the way there. His pressure also had settled. So probably his pressure spike additionally was because of the herpetic keratouveitis or the herpetic element. The mistake was sometimes in a busy day, we don't look at all our background data carefully enough. And so what is the possible solution is that some things will make a difference to your management each and every time when you're selecting a new drug. So you should put them on your cover sheet, so that in the overlook, you don't have to wade through all your notes. Just look at the cover sheet and all the important points will be highlighted there. It was an act of omission on my part. So patient medically controlled mild POHG on single combo medication when was scheduled for cataract surgery. So he underwent the surgeries, and he'd been instructed to discontinue the latanoprost for a period of 2 weeks after surgery, which we would resume subsequently. And 1 week post the second eye surgery was doing well. Intraocular pressures are fine. So with the standard instructions for tapering, we scheduled a review for 3 weeks to reassess for glasses. The patient came back and everything was doing fine, but the pressures had gone up. And we were wondering why. And on questioning, the patient had discontinued his anti-glaucoma medications because the discharge summary did not state clearly that they were to continue with the timolol and to resume the prostaglandin at 2 weeks. The patient stopped the medication. So the mistake was that don't verbally tell and expect the patient to understand and remember. Make sure that any patient of glaucoma who's undergoing just cataract surgery has that clearly mentioned, and on follow-up when you're tapering the medications, repeat that he's to restart the medication at whatever time. Asthmatic elderly gentleman who had previous surgeries for phacotrap and is now back onto medication. There was slight fluctuation in intraocular pressure in a very compliant patient, and there was some progression. So the patient, because he's asthmatic, we decided let's try brimonidine. 3 weeks later, his daughter called saying, can you come to the hospital for a visit, because he's not able to come in for your follow-up because he's had drowsiness, loss of balance, and his pulse rate has dropped. And the physician was investigating him for possible hypotension, hyponatremia. After visiting, I asked her to stop the medication, and the pulse rate came back to normal, and the patient practically recovered in 2 or 3 days and could be discharged. So whenever you're adding medication, you look at the ideal for whatever is the he's asthmatic, so you don't want to add. But don't forget there are other things, especially in the elderly. Brimonidine can cause a lot of unexpected side effects, and it can land us in a big soup. I was lucky that he recovered fast, but it would have been fairly disastrous for him. The next case is of a elderly lady, hypertensive, with a poor vision in one eye and practically one-eyed, and is on a routine follow-up, has comes at slightly uncomfortable, and feels that the vision is dropping. And because of the PCO, and he assumed that it was that, and the pressure was also slightly high. So we assumed that let's step up the medication, then take care of the PCO if necessary. And the patient had dropped vision subsequently when she came back on review, and it couldn't have obviously been the PCO had increased. So since the only thing different had been done was added the medication, we discontinued and went back in and looked at the. So initially we just looked at the disc. Now if you look at it carefully, I missed this, and that should have been picked up. There's a disc collateral there. So apart from the glaucoma, patient had an old vein occlusion, and the prostaglandin aggravated the macular edema, and the vision dropped because of the macular edema. So patient had to be aggressively managed for the CME, and subsequently I moved the patient back off latanoprost and put them onto medication. So the mistake was that every time you're making any change, look at the patient all over again as if it's a fresh person. And I could have just saved them this hassle and maybe used timolol or dorzolamide at the outset and possibly prevented this from happening. This is the last case, and I added pilocarpine as a last ditch because the other things were not tolerated. And I was very happy the next time when the pressure dropped to 10, but the vision had also dropped. And thankfully the vision dropped because I dilated and I saw that the retina had detached to a fresh rhegmatogenous RD. Patient had a large lattices, and one of them must have ripped a hole. So before starting, we don't use pilocarpine very often, and it was a low myop, so I didn't think there'd be such huge changes. But luckily, the patient settled after surgery. Otherwise, I would. That's the take-home message. Make note of all clinical findings which can alter our decision on the cover sheet. Before changing any treatment, re-examine the patient from start to finish. Give clear written instructions whenever you're making the changes, and re-emphasize verbally, if possible, also to the relative. And carefully consider comorbidities, systemic medications when making a choice, and warn the patient about all the potential side effects, no matter how rare or inconsequential they may seem to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. That was a fabulous talk. And you've not only enumerated the mistakes you made and how to rectify and how not to make the mistakes again. That was really a nice talk. Now I am going to start my screen sharing and I am going to be talking to you about the mistakes I have made in trabeculectomy. So I am going to be playing directly from the, one moment. So my mistakes in trabeculectomy, the video is seen? Yeah. So
Well
this
seen.
is, yeah. So now this is 3 I have enumerated, and the first mistake starts after making a nice flap. And earlier days of my practice, what I used to do is I would not gradually decompress, I would gradually perform a sclerotomy, and this caused a sudden decompression and collapse of anterior chamber. And now all of us know that sudden decompression, loss of AC can cause post-op shallow ACs, choroidal, suprachoroidal. It is the root cause of wipeout. And so I have come out with this little cocktail. Now the first thing I do, and because all of us we operate as glaucoma specialists, I do people with high IOPs even on table, a gradual decompression with a 26 number needle. Get a little time, give a little time for the eye to get used to the hypotony, then do a small paracentesis with a side port. Of course, this could have been done with a little more finesse, but yes, make a small paracentesis, then inject air inside into the slightly hypotenuse eye, and after that you inject a little viscoelastic. All this is enough to just make the chamber full, and I'll tell you how it helps. Now this is one thing. I am doing this trabeculectomy and I don't use punches, I don't like a punch. So I have made this incision with I have penetrated with the side port, thinking that I have penetrated equally in the entire length. Now look at this, even after the air bubble comes out, even though I have penetrated, I do not get a AC, flat AC, it does not collapse, it remains. And I am now trying to make the sclerotomy ostium with this, with the Vanna scissors, holding what I feel is a full thickness flap, but now I realize it is not a full thickness flap. All I have is a slit shaped opening which is not going to filter at all, and an overhanging edge. Now, so the first probably the mistakes which I made was the blade was not perpendicular to what I am cutting, and that is why shelved edge. It was not full thickness in all areas, not sharp enough for a slightly hypotenuse eye, and now you are going to watch me struggle. Now you can go back at this point of time, somebody would say why not use a punch, but I did not think of using a punch, though now I feel yes I could have, but the thing is I do not like punches. I have used all companies, but somehow I am not comfortable, and now it is really a struggle. The only reason why I could probably uses it because I use this Fechner's forceps, which allows as a ring like platform which allows you to hold comfortably, but again it is, so if the first step is wrong, you suffer for the rest of the steps, and I am now trying to increase the sclerotomy. It is a struggle, but you have to see that the cocktail which I have made of air bubble and the viscoelastic, even after all this maneuvering, it does not allow the AC to collapse. So that is one more thing which this procedures have helped me. Now I suddenly decide I need to do the iridectomy and push the iris back, and after pushing the iris back, now I can go ahead and enlarge my ostium. So this was one mistake, that use a very sharp blade, hold it perpendicular, make sure that you go full thickness, and if you do it correctly, it can be as simple as that. Like this is the way it should go, full thickness, make sure again that cocktail inside of the air bubble and the viscoelastic, it acts as a buffer. Just hold this and make sure. Now another thing is that Vannas, usually we want them to be very sharp here, but the tip also has to be equally sharp if you want to use the Vannas to make an ostium. Now this is the way you can very simply make a nice ostium. So now the mistake number 3 I have made is, in my earlier days I did not use releasable sutures, but these are a boon to all glaucoma surgeons and anybody who is going to do a glaucoma surgery. So one way I am showing is that yes, 50% corneal bite first. This is how you do it. It's very simple and I now regret not doing it earlier. It could have saved me so many interventions. Then you take the bite through the side and you pull it. You pull it till you come to the edge of the, you do it using your standard 10-0 nylon sutures. And so now here you have a loop. So you pull the loop and 3 throws, grab the loop and tighten it properly, yes, and then you are going to cut it very close. So when, and of course you are going to cut the long and short also, and which you can pull at the slit lamp. So thanks to Team MOS, my audience, Dr. Pooja Bhomaj, Dr. Rita, Sachin, Rupali and all my team for their support. And with this I am going to stop my screen sharing and escape.
Very nice videos, Dr. Preeti.
Thank you so much. Now I am going to figure out how to go back to, yes. So now we have enough time, about 10-11 minutes we have for discussion. So Pooja, I am going to ask you that what according to you is the most common mistake which comprehensive ophthalmologists make when they are evaluating the disc? What according to you is the most common mistake?
While seeing the disc, I think the size of the disc is not considered very commonly.
Okay.
Seeing whether it is a small size disc or large size disc, that is not assessed. So just looking at the cupping, even if it is physiological and a large disc, it is labeled as glaucoma and patients are on treatment with those findings.
Yes, that's true.
And
That yeah.
and glaucoma in small discs are very commonly missed. Yeah.
Yes, that's so true. That one thing is that large cup disc ratio is the bane for that patient, you know, like he runs the risk of being labeled as a glaucoma patient whenever and wherever he goes and visits somebody else. So, Dr. Sachin, if you can tell me that how would you advise comprehensive ophthalmologists to not make this mistake? Like we have seen this so many times that we say that look at the disc size, large cup disc ratio is not glaucoma, but yet you see these things happen again and again. So what is one way you can suggest to the comprehensive ophthalmologist to stop that from happening?
Are you saying clinically or by investigations?
Clinically. And of course then he goes to, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, as she's rightly pointed out, Dr. Pooja, you have to basically measure off the disc from the graticule on the slit lamp. So you have an approximate idea of what the disc size is. Always when you have a CD ratio asymmetry, also measure the disc size of both the eyes and then compare. So if you have an asymmetry in the disc size and the cup disc ratio, you know you may be dealing at a normal disc. Whereas if the disc size is same and then you have asymmetric CD ratio, then it makes more clinical significance if you go only from the stereo biomicroscopy point of view. So documenting disc size is very important. 78D lens is a very good tool because magnification factor is also 1.1. So it's very easy. And apart from that, look at the other signs very closely, like disc hemorrhages or slit RNFL defects and all those things.
So
Can I
thank
come
you,
in to make
Sachin.
a
Yeah, Rita, please. I was going to
What
tell
I
you.
think is the easiest way for a general ophthalmologist to make out what the disc size is, just look at the distance of the disc from the macula. A normal size disc is about 2.5 times that from the macula. A large disc will naturally come much closer and a smaller disc will have more than 3 disc diameter. So it's a very simple thing that you can do on a disc examination.
That's a fabulous tip,
Yeah.
Dr. Rita. And Sachin, so you are saying that they should actually measure the disc size when in doubt. So in a large, so what I would give as a take home to the participants is, if you see a large cup disc ratio, you are not very sure whether it is glaucomatous or no. So, one is use Dr. Rita's tip, and second is in that one patient you can certainly go ahead and measure the disc size and compare the disc size with what you know. So, you do not have to spend time in each doing it for each disc in a busy practice, but yes, whenever you feel it is a large disc, a large cup disc ratio, please do it, it is well worth its time. And so we come to the second question I have. So we can have Sachin. Sachin, what is the most common mistake you have found? Now, what your mistakes were more technical because you have a know-how of the OCT because you are a glaucoma specialist. A comprehensive ophthalmologist may not have the same know-how. So, what according to you is the most common mistake made by a comprehensive ophthalmologist when they are evaluating the OCT, the optic nerve with the OCT, and how can they rectify it?
Basically, the most important error is forcing the wrong OCT machine on the patient. As I said, for glaucoma diagnosis and progression, you cannot use any OCT machine for simple reasons I had illustrated in my talk in the previous session. It's very important that you have that kind of hardware and software. Rather, hardware, I would say, software can be tweaked anyhow, but if your hardware is not good enough to measure or not good enough to reproduce, then unfortunately you cannot use it for glaucoma diagnosis. This has been the bane of OCT imaging, and all the talks from the last decade, they have compared various machines without going enough into the technical part. So when you buy a machine or use it for specifically for glaucoma, you should know completely from head to tail of what the machine is, the limitations, the drawbacks. And as I said, all OCT machines can be used only as screening tests for glaucoma, and only a handful of them can be used for actual clinical evaluation and your progression analysis. Now, I showed the examples in the slide where I showed you the disc, the RNFL and the ganglion cell map. So many of these lower end machines do not have a ganglion cell mapping technology at all. Now, as I said, you can't examine a patient without looking at his head. So if you don't see the ganglion cell body and you're just looking at the tail, that is the axons, you're not going to get the complete picture. So this is the common thing. Most of the printouts are like this, and the first printout that I showed without any scan.
So Sachin, the point is well taken, but everybody cannot afford a super duper expensive machine. But those who are referring, then yes, definitely you can refer to a center which has a good machine. So those who are referring, you certainly have the choice, but sometimes your choice is limited by the the kind of resources you have. So Rita, yes, you want to say anything? Rupali, if you have.
To make that in the common mistakes that ophthalmologists do, even if they have a great machine, is they must realize that they have to use the macular thickness as much in every patient that they are using their OCT for to diagnose glaucoma. Normally what happens is that they just get one OCT glaucoma RNFL ONH printout, and then they look at the reds and the greens, and that is how they diagnose their glaucomas. No, we have to stress upon the point that you have to get a macular thickness map, because that is where a lot of information lies, which can be easily correlated.
So a take home for the OCT for the comprehensive ophthalmologist would be, if you are refer to a center which has a good machine, and second is use the ganglion cell analysis more comprehensively, more often, and you will be able to detect much more than what you do with only RNFL this thing. Now,
also not to look at only the red and the green, and also look at all the various components.
That's
look for
components, yes, yes.
Look at segmentation errors. Don't just look at red or green and start off treatment.
Yes.
Basically, you should be technically very well versed, because you can easily,
Or
no, that's a point well taken, but not everybody comprehensive ophthalmologists are going to go to the trouble of looking into the each.
Madam, then I don't think they have a choice to use this machine for decision making.
So
you get trigger happy at times if you use this machine irresponsibly, and you start medication, and we find so many. Madam Rita Damonkar, madam is smiling. She might be seeing exactly the same number of patients being treated on red maps and green maps.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So we have about 3 minutes. Ragini, just 3 minutes, and we'll give away the hall. So Rupali, that was a beautiful talk. And what do you think are the most commonly made mistakes by comprehensive ophthalmologists in when they start medical management?
First to start
Preeti,
treatment
hi,
on single
Ragini.
reading.
Can I interrupt? Can I interrupt?
Of course, please, Ragini.
Hall is free till 2 p.m.
Oh wow!
Wow.
That's nice. That's
Oh,
nice.
and
That's
no,
wonderful.
The hall's closed because we can enjoy the music at Ishwar Chandra Hall. Good afternoon, Rita ma'am.
Good afternoon, Ragini.
But just wanted to make you comfortable that even I am enjoying the discussion. I'm not here to close down the hall. I just came to give a big hug to you and wish Rita ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ragini. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh,
Thank
not at all. That was nice. No, we now get more time. Yeah. So Rupali, please go ahead.
First is to start treatment on a single pressure reading, and to start off, if it's like if the first reading is say 30 or 28, they'll start off with a combination straight away. That is the commonest mistake I've seen. The commonest tendency is to whether it is optimal for that particular situation or not is to start off with a combination of inflow drugs, brimonidine and timolol or dorzolamide and timolol, whichever is on their favorites list, without really worrying about whether it is optimal for that patient or not. And technically, if you see anything except for timolol, if you look at the amount that is used, is going to cost the patient a lot of money. So it doesn't really wash that. It is more economical. It is used in weird combinations. Sometimes they'll be told to use the medication once a day, but at night. For example, timolol once a day, OD medication to be used at night when it's the least effective. Or it will be in a without specifically saying. So the patient is using it in the morning by their convenience, and again one more time at 12 o'clock. So the spacing, the importance of the timing is not emphasized. Those are commonest mistakes that you see happening.
See, whatever I have seen is that many times the patients, just because they are not affording, they are started on something else other than a prostaglandin. But so do you agree with that kind of scenario where you say the person is not affording, and that's why you start the person on brimonidine timolol but not on any prostaglandin analog?
That's what.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything except for timolol is not cost effective and
That's
has greater.
Madam, brimonidine is costly, Preeti madam.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
It is costly.
It is more
Prostaglandin
is twice
expensive.
safe,
They are
finishes
cheaper.
fast.
Yes. Yeah. So if you agree with me, all of you, that unless there are some specific contraindications like what Rupali had pointed out, that prostaglandin remains the first choice of treatment in most of our patients. So I hope you agree with me on that part.
Absolutely.
Unless contraindicated, of course. Like
Yeah, that's what I said. Unless there are specific contraindications, then yes. So this is one take home I want to give to the comprehensive ophthalmologists who are attending this session, that unaffordability is not a reason anymore. The only thing is, as Rupali has said, timolol is cheaper, otherwise the rest are far more expensive than prostaglandins. So start prostaglandins even if the person is not affording. And there are enough, one drop, say you have prostaglandins for 150 rupees also, which can last them for a long, and you can help them with samples. So that is one thing which I wanted to get out of the way. Now other thing is, I have found that people don't know their combinations. So you will find brimonidine is twice a day, then in another combination brimonidine is another 2 times a day. So what is the advice you would give? There is a plethora of medications now. How would you ask a comprehensive ophthalmologist, how would you advise him that how to remember it? Should they make a list? What should they do? Sachin, please. Or Rupali, go ahead, please.
Let him get it out of the way. Then I will.
Sachin, please. Yes.
Yeah, so funnily, there is about medical therapy, two of the biggest problems that I notice is, one is that the patients, they have glaucoma medicines all right, but most of the times, at least 90% of the patients who have come naive to me, that is the first visit, putting medications, do not close their eyes after putting the drops. And this is the glaring mistake I would tell all general ophthalmologists to avoid. Be prescribing medication is not the end of the story. In glaucoma medicine, every small thing matters. Occlusion is very important, otherwise the medicine will give only side effects and no effect into the eye. So always tell the patient to at least close the eye for 3 to 5 minutes. If you tell somebody has told them punctal occlusion, but they have not told them where the punctum is, so they keep on pressing the nasal bone. very, very common. If you just audit all your patients, you will come to know. So at least with all glaucoma patients, make sure to tell them at least close the eye for 5 minutes. If there is a case of polypharmacy where the patient is having a mix of lubricant medication to tide over the complications of glaucoma medication, at least mark which medication is the glaucoma medication, so that otherwise they'll put the lubricant more diligently and miss the glaucoma medication. So this is very, very important. Which medications are glaucoma medications? Tell them to do the occlusion properly, at least after the glaucoma medications, to either prevent the systemic side effects and ensure proper effect. And the lubricant medications, you can give them the liberty of either skipping or putting as and when they want. So this patient education is very important, and it is lacking in most of the patients that we see.
Sachin, I'm talking about doctor education. How does he remember?
Okay.
Because
So
they
here's what I suggest.
yeah, tell me.
They should
Rupali.
pick two or three companies that they like, and they should make a list of all the glaucoma medications that are manufactured by that company and the content. Then all they have to do is remember which mix and match to do. As long as the content is not getting reused, that is good enough. But if they try and keep every company happy, it is not going to work out, because it is not possible. The names no longer reflect the content.
The content, I agree.
So it's all catchy names, and on top of that, there'll be preservative free, BAK free, and etc. So it's very difficult to remember the whole combination. So pick 2 or 3 companies for glaucoma and decide, like, make a chart of what their contents are, and then it's easy enough, because it can be at the most 3 or 4 group like medications.
So I would also suggest
medication.
I would suggest also that make a chart of not only the names and the cost also. Sometimes you want to have, there are some brands which are cheaper, there are some brands which are more expensive. Not everybody can afford expensive brands, though you may trust them more. So not only have some companies which have which you trust and the medications with their contents, but also have their cost written. So you know which are the cheaper ones, and you can offer them to patients when you feel that this person cannot afford it.
So this is a solution for this. We in Dinanath are not allowed to write the brand name per se. We are supposed to write the pharmacological content. So what we've taken to doing is, we write Brimonidine plus Timolol, and in our pharmacy we'll have 3 or 4 different company ke brands available. But I've gotten into the habit, and you write it and then ask them. Most of the people will check on NetMeds and find the correct combination, and they will send you a WhatsApp saying, can I use this instead of that? This is cheaper. So that is a solution. You write the name of the drug and in brackets give 3 or 4 options, and then whichever is the cheapest they can buy.
So what happens is, Rupali, it's mandatory that we have to write the contents, and then next to that, if you have a brand preference, then you have to write the brand name. So that's now mandatory. That's all of us are doing. But there are some brands which we prefer, and we would want the patient to use that if he is affording. So you give the choice when a person is not affording, but that's a point well taken. So Pooja, you have anything else to add to this about how medical management can be administered better by a comprehensive ophthalmologist?
Just to bring one point in the discussion here, does the panel feel that any of the specific drugs of a class are better tolerated as compared to the generic brands? What is the personal experience, especially in prostaglandins like latanoprost? And do you see a tangible difference in terms of the ocular surface behavior or patient comfort with generic vis-a-vis the innovator brands?
Rita, can you answer that question?
I
please?
think
Then
there is a
Pooja.
definite difference. Yeah, we are all absolutely sure that there is a definite difference. If you look at bimetoprost, we all know that bimetoprost is known to marginally be better in terms of pressure reduction, which is marginally, but invariably over a period of time, you do get to see a lot of side effects of like redness, like orbital discoloration,
Orbitopathy, yeah.
and the orbitopathy. So that deep socket thing, all of that is seen much more with bimetoprost than with any of the other prostaglandins that are available to us as of now, even the branded ones.
But is it, so I think it is molecule specific and it is not
Molecule
company specific.
So it is molecule specific.
Yeah. So what Sachin is asking is that do you find
Company
it a
specific,
different
madam.
company specific? I
Don't you find-
personally do not find, unless there are some companies which I avoid like plague, but I have not sort of differentiated into generic and non-generics. They are good companies and they are not good companies. So it's not based on their origin, but it's based on my personal experience. So that, yes, I have definitely found, but not really generics and multinationals. That I have not really found.
But there
Question-
have been studies which have told us very, very specifically that there is a lot of difference between generics and branded medications, especially because it is not mandatory for them to have the same pH. The other excipients that you are adding to the medication, other than the medication itself, does not have to be the same. It is also not, because in the eyes there is no testing that you can do for the percentage of the medication that is available as vis-a-vis other medications. So in principle, I would definitely think that branded medications have proven to be what they are. Generics keep telling us that they are as good as, but there is no standard way in which you can say that, okay, this generic is good.
Okay.
Having
Good.
said that,
So-
let me also tell you that a population like ours in India, and I practice in rural India, I don't practice like Rupali or both of you in the cities. So I know that there is a lot of poverty, and getting those drugs is not the easiest thing for them, because at the end of the day, we want to see our patients taking their medications, not just taking the first bottle because we insist that they should take that bottle and then stop the medication.
Pooja, you have
Yeah.
because-
I wanted to
please, yes.
say the same thing.
Yes.
Availability of the drug is another thing. Like in periphery, you may not be getting all the brands, and the company may not keep on providing that drug. At the end, some brands will suddenly switch off providing that medication. It has happened, like in between. I don't want to mention the name, but for some 6 months, the brand totally disappeared from the market. So availability of the drug in all the pharmacies or the nearest pharmacy is one of the major criteria to decide like which anti-glaucoma to write.
Oh,
So,
so
no,
that
if,
that is one
I
of the
feel that if
reason
they can
why-
stick
yeah.
with the same brand, I think eventually, 2 millimeters of difference will make a huge difference at the end of the day for advanced glaucoma. But we don't really need that millimeter ka accuracy for every patient. So if the cost is a huge difference and the availability is better with certain generics, I think it is worth using it for those without worrying I'm not getting that extra 1 millimeter and everything.
Yeah. So it
just
should be
one
available.
answer.
The patient
Yeah.
should have the faith in that medication, and this medication is easily available everywhere. So
Just
that also is very important.
This is the answer to this question in yes or no. Rupali, do you prefer multinational or generics? In a patient who's unaffording everything.
According and everything also, sometimes I will use
Generics. So you are not convinced that generics are worse off than this thing. That's why so I am in your team. What about Pooja? Yes or no? Do you think generics, forget about affordability, forget about this. Given an ideal situation, do you feel multinationals do better than generics?
Not always. I think previously they used to. With time, I think generics are also doing equally good. There are
Alright.
some generics which are as good, or maybe they are better sometimes. Yeah.
So Rita, what about you? Yes or no? Sorry,
I think
multinational,
the branded, are definitely
branded. All right. What about Sachin?
Yeah, I'll just try to answer that slightly scientifically.
No, yeah.
No,
Okay.
Let me tell you why.
Yes or no, I'm not giving
I'll give you an example. I'll just give you an example. So what we did was, this was an interesting thing. If you see that this molecule that they introduced just now, Azarga, the multinational company introduced, then I just tried to, because of this generic branded debate, go through the contents of the bottle, and I compared it to Brinzoxti and Brinzotim. And if you see, there is no excipient at all that is mentioned in Brinzotim as well as Brinzoxti. Now we decided to test whether these excipients really work in the clinic, because he has added 7 excipients, the brand. So if there is no use of adding 7 excipients to a particular drug, then why the expense in the research of adding the excipients as well as the cost, because excipients are not going to come for free. So what we did was we sent these samples to the UDCT, that is Institute of Chemical Technology, to see whether there is any tangible difference in these 3 in terms of properties. So that's the last property is getting evaluated right now. I'll be able to give you the data within a week or 10 days, because this is some very important issue, because for us, we are therapists, it is fine. But a person who's going to have that drop on his ocular surface day in and day out for the rest of his lifetime, we have to be absolutely sure what we are giving them. Like if these excipients make a difference in the final ocular surface tolerability, the final bioavailability in the eye, is something that we should scientifically know, because 7 to 8 excipients just can't be not be there for for nothing. So we have to be slightly. I tried to be scientific. I will be getting the data right now. As far as the pH and the other data and the sedimentation rate was concerned, I've got the data. Only the main viscosity data is pending, which will affect the residence time on the ocular surface and the drug concentration inside the eye. So that will be available this week. I'll update you all.
So what I can say is we have used these for years together, brinzolamide, timolol combinations of different things, and we have not found any significant difference, at least me, and that's why I support Rupali and Pooja, that I am not like brand MNC.
No, we
Alright.
should find the answer.
So exactly. So now here for the comprehensive ophthalmologist, the jury is divided. So the take home is, one is prostaglandins are the first medical management unless there is a specific contraindication. The jury is divided onto the multinational versus the generics. That debate is going to rage on and on. And the thing is, if you have multiple drops, the different companies with different names, make a list, write down their cost, also know their side effects, timings, and stick it somewhere in your clinic where if you sort of forget, you can have easy access to and refresh your memory. And so with this, I end this session. It was wonderful having all of you here. My special thanks to MOS, Dr. Ragini, Rita, Sachin, Rupali, Pooja for your wonderful talks, and also to my team for supporting me, and to the audience for being a wonderful audience. Thank you so much and have a great time.
For being a wonderful moderator. That we have.
Thank you so much, and see you again in physical, maybe at Guwahati.